Hello, everyone, and welcome to a brand new Record Club episode of the Jams Tea Podcast, where we spin the jams and spill the tea. And this week, we are covering my recommended record, which is the incomparable, the infamous, the controversial White Light, White Heat by the Velvet Underground. And honestly, we don't really need to introduce who the Velvet Underground are in like a broad sense, just because they are one of the quintessential foundational rock bands that basically defined an entire movement and genre and subgenre. And I'm pretty sure I once listened to one of Stephen Hyden's podcast episodes where he quoted someone else who said something like, not everyone bought the first Velvet Underground album when it came out, but everyone who did buy it went and started their own band.
That's a Brian Eno quote, if you can believe it or not.
See, that just goes to show you how much of a huge, big deal this band is. And the reason I wanted to pick White Light, White Heat isn't necessarily because it's my favorite Velvet Underground album. It isn't. But because when I listened to it, I was just sort of dumbfounded by everything about its construction that I was just like, this isn't my favorite, but I certainly think this is going to be the most interesting to talk about. And to sort of lay the groundwork for our discussion, I think it's best if we at least go into a little bit of what was going on with the band at the time, because they came out with the Velvet Underground and Nico 1967, one of the most important and most acclaimed rock albums of all time. Had songs on it like Heroin. You've probably heard this album. It's fucking huge 4chan music core shit. But basically, the Velvet Underground are defined by two really, really big creative presences. Those are John Cale and, of course, Lou Reed. And at the time, Velvet Underground was not really, it's aptly titled. They were not a very popular band in their inception. They, in fact, got Andy Warhol, the artist Andy Warhol, to do the cover of their first album, mainly because Lou kind of made him the manager of the band, even though Andy didn't really do all that much with them. He just kind of gave them art and let them play in places and underground scenes and got them involved in that entire sort of, underground world.
He funded them basically. He funded them. Yeah. He got them into clubs.
A record label, honestly.
Yeah, and his name is the only text on the original cover of the album as well.
Yeah. And so you have that, and that's sort of foundational little album there. But what happens is that 1 year later, we're at, they're going to record a new album, but a lot of shit is going on internally within the band. If you want to be a little bit reductionist about it, you can kind of compare Cale and Reed to Lennon and McCartney in some respects, in that they are both really big forces of creative power and energy within their specific bands, but both of them have very different sensibilities that often lead to clashing within their discography and sometimes occasionally congealing in surprising ways. But Cale was Cale is known as a guy who is really experimental, really with stuff like just raw sound play and drone and shit that's really avant-garde, especially for the time. And Lou Reed, as funny as this sounds, was the more accessible, punky counterpart to John Cale, which sort of leads to the collision of sounds that you find on the original Velvet Underground album. And the interesting thing is that up until that point, they didn't really have those identities. In fact, Lou Reed didn't really make anything that's hugely indicative of who he was at that point. He was trying to, but it wasn't really he hadn't come out with any of the definitive solo projects that he would probably be more renowned for. And kind of the same thing with Cale is that even though one was the sort of uglier, more avant-garde guy, he was still pursuing things that are distinctly sensible in terms of their approach to art. And what happened is that Lou Reed comes along and he wants the Velvet Underground to be his band. He had problems with the first album because Andy Warhol helped bring in Nico, who was the presence along with them, the lead singer. And Lou didn't really care for that all that much. I mean, it might have been an ego thing, who knows? but he was really like, he really felt like he had been sort of displaced, I think, in his own band. And so I think his attempt with White Light, White Heat was to try and claim back some of that. But John also had his own idea for what the album really was. And you can feel the struggle of these two artists, these boundless creative energies sort of hitting each other. But I think it's generally accepted that John Cale kind of won this particular struggle because it's very much way more noisy and weird and structurally wonky. It's something that, like, it makes his departure after this album make sense because the self-titled comes after this, and that is a very much like a softer, nocturnal, very Lou Reed-y kind of affair. So that leads us to White Light, White Heat.
So a few important things to kind of appreciate as well is that before the Velvet Underground were a thing, like Lou Reed was this kind of like jock figure who worked as a kind of subversive artist. So he was hired to, one of his early jobs, I believe, was writing like parodies of pop songs essentially, and like taking the familiar and sort of like and inserting seeds of the subversive into it. And that's sort of the mindset that he always approached with Velvet Underground with. John Cale actually was the more sort of famous artist before the Velvet Underground came to be. And they essentially lucked out in getting him involved. He was very taken with Lou as a performer. And so you had these two men come together, this synergy. And I think that broadly the different ways in which they're painted in terms of like their different approaches to songwriting is broadly accurate, but also to sort of embellish. It's obviously a little more complicated than that as well, because while this record, when you listen to it, White Light, White Heat, a lot of what jumps out is, well, John Cale for starters, who is doing lead vocals on 2 of the 5 songs, and also his famous sort of viola drones, which featured all over the first Velvet Underground album and one of the sort of signature sonic aspects of their sound, but also his just eclectic sound design when it comes to an instrumental perspective. Like when I think about this album, I think about the most iconic sonic aspect of this album is his organ playing in Sister Ray, which is, I mean, we'll get to that, but it's very unique and very kind of disconcerting from a pure musical standpoint. But also, I think Lou's own contribution to the insanity of this record shouldn't be understated as well. Another of the most iconic musical pieces of musicality in any Velvet Underground song is his soloing on I Heard Her Call My Name, which is some of the most outlandish and insane guitar soloing you've ever heard. Lou spoke in interviews about wanting to infuse the spirit of Ornette Coleman's early free jazz albums into the composition of this record as well. So I think while Lou and John were certainly approaching their musical construction from slightly different perspectives and songwriting from slightly different perspectives, I think the band were reasonably united on wanting to make this record what it was. Where the band started to fracture was in how the record ended up sounding. The biggest and most crucial part of the story of how this album came to be is before work even started on this, Lou Reed fired Andy Warhol. And that was something that came quite suddenly and quite unexpectedly. And, you know, from a career standpoint is kind of quite bizarre. And, but I think sets up the ultimate sort of subversion of the Velvet Underground that this record represents, as well as, of course, being an ugly sort of furtherance of some of their most avant-garde instincts on the first album. But of course, the thing that people love about that first album is how it balances those ugly avant-garde instincts with kind of genuine beauty. And Nico, I think, is a crucial part of that too. So here you have a record that's both uglier by design, incredibly different sonically in terms of the production, and very different structurally and kind of quite unwieldy in terms of album construction, and also kind of sounding like you have a bunch of musicians who are kind of all fighting each other musically in each song. Jakob, what's your perspective on this record? I see you've got a Velvet Underground t-shirt on, so you're obviously a big fan.
Yeah.
Where do you come at this record from, and what do you feel is important to appreciate about this album?
Okay, so the last Record Club episode I came in on was Pet Sounds. And it makes sense because that album was originally an album I did not care for at all. Meanwhile, this is a record of the 60s I absolutely adored when I was the age when I didn't like Pet Sounds, because I got into this album like a lot of favorite albums at the time through Kurt Cobain. He wrote very like he praised the hell out of White Light, White Heat in his journals, and of course, like he did a cover of one of the songs, "Here She Comes Now," and when I heard this album, like that's like, okay, my hero Kurt Cobain loves this record. I gotta listen to it. I don't know, like it just like from the first minute, I knew that this was something that I was going to love. Just from like the opening like chord structure of how like noisy and disgusting and strangely beautiful this was. I would call the opening track, if there was, I mean, of course, like you could have endless debates about this, but this feels like the birth of punk rock. Like it's a song that clocks in at under 3 minutes and is a depressing yet happy song about doing amphetamines. And I don't know, when I first heard that song and Lou Reed's very kind of, ooh, white light kind of delivery, I was just so fucking, I don't know, like this album puts me at a loss for words, because like just from the opening track alone, I am just already just extremely into it. And then the gift plays and I don't know what the hell is going on, because like John Cale is reading the story in one speaker of my headphones, and the band is like doing this jam session in the right side of the headphones, and I had never heard anything like that before. Now, like again, in high school, my music taste was extremely basic. I liked top 40 songs. I was getting more into pop music at the time, but also like kind of classic rock, I guess. And the Velvet Underground was a band that was definitely, of course, well known and well liked, but they brought me onto bands that were more influenced by them. And as a result, this album is very, very important to me in my musical history.
Ryley, you mentioned what Lou Reed kind of did before all of this. And I think that's crucial to understanding why the impact of the first song is so like hefty, is because you were immediately met with the like, this is an album of dichotomies for me. And the dichotomy of White Light, White Heat, the title track and the first song here, is that this is like, I mean, the vocals here, it's like a doo-wop delivery. It's really like traditional, and the instrumental is so fuzzed out and fucking noisy, you can barely even tell what the fuck is playing in the background. I mean, it sounds like it was a normal rock song that someone put in a microwave, and then they just took it out and they were like, oh fuck this, fuck shit, don't touch it, it's hot. And that's what the whole album sounds like.
Well, and that's a good point to pick up on, because I think with anyone who encounters this record, the first thing that you're confronted with, the first thing you really notice is the production, the sound of this thing. And I mean, to put it frankly, this thing sounds terrible. Like it sounds awful. It sounds absolutely compressed to all hell, to the point where in a number of the louder tracks, the instrumentals and the interactions between the instruments are barely distinguishable. The one thing that it most strongly reminds me of is a recording of John Coltrane's last concert at Olatunji, which wasn't actually released for decades after it was performed, but actually I believe was about a year before this album. That, if you listen to that record, that's the only other record I can think of that has a similar sort of approach to production, where it's like, let's just not make it sound good at all. Let's just, and then that's a bootleg, to be fair, but like, what's interesting about the story of how this album was constructed is essentially that the members of the Velvet Underground, Lou Reed and John Cale in particular, kind of disregarded all ideas of good taste and all ideas of sounding good. And what's interesting about that is that the members of the Velvet Underground, particularly Sterling Morrison and Mo Tucker, eventually have, or actually quite quickly after the album came out, kind of renounced the sound of it and said, well, this didn't come out the way we wanted it to sound. There was a lot of sort of backpedaling. I think a big part of the reason why the third Velvet Underground record sounds the way it does is not just because of John Cale's absence, but also as kind of a reaction to how extreme this album is. And so you put it on and you're confronted with that. And it is at times unpleasant to listen to. It's at times disorienting. It's at times confusing. I think The Gift is a great example of how disorienting listening to this record can be, because you do have this story, which I love listening to John Cale's incredibly thick Welsh accent. The Welsh accent is just like one of my favorite accents because it sounds like a fairy people. Like it just it doesn't sound like a real human.
It sounds like a character from a Tolkien novel is describing to you the events through which eventually a man gets so stupendously down bad that he mails himself to his girlfriend and ends up having his head cut off. I mean, it's so fucking I that was when I knew we had to talk about this album, is that I was walking my dog and I was listening to The Gift, and then I was just like, because spoken word shit, it's not always not always my favorite thing about albums generally, but like the storytelling and language and prose here is so immediately arresting that I was just like, what the where the hell's this going? And it's just like, you have the first kind of act of it is like this dude who's like, oh, his girlfriend moved away to go to college and he's on his own and he's lonely and sad and he doesn't have any money, and finds out it's cheaper to mail himself in a crate to fucking, I think, like Wisconsin, Michigan, someplace fucking, and to mail himself there. So he just like gets in there and gets loaded into a truck, and then it immediately like cuts over. It's like really cinematic. It immediately cuts over to the girlfriend, who you are immediately made clear does not give a fuck about this guy anymore, who has been like living her life and is so utterly unconcerned. It's just like, oh, this fucking dude at a party the other night named, I think his name's Bill. He was just like, we had sex, but he didn't say, or he said, I don't actually like, I care about you, but I'm not in love with you. And she's like, that's fine, I guess. It's like,
what's one of the things I love about the storytelling is like you get so immersed in Waldo's world, and then you cut to Martha, I think her name is, and you actually get a real sense of her life before the story kind of returns to Waldo again, and the way he's reintegrated. It's incredibly well written. Like I should say as well, this short story was written by Lou Reed for a creative writing class, I think. And then the decision to have Cale read it, I think, is really, really smart, because he has a voice that's better attuned to kind of feeling out the humor in the story and also the kind of genuine sort of pathos as well. Like he's able to read it with a quality that really accentuates all of those factors. Whereas if Lou Reed was reading it, it would be like, it would be a mess. He just doesn't have the voice for that kind of thing. So it's really smart to do it the way they do.
He would make it sound like cynical and sarcastic, whereas Cale makes it sound so genuine that like the humor is brought out through that.
You need that little contrast.
Yeah, and I love the amount of puns that are in this. Like there's always like a bunch of like sexual puns. Like he grabbed he put himself into his package. Like when she calls Bill a schmuck or Waldo a schmuck, that's a Yiddish word for penis. So like that I absolutely kind of love about this is that there's like, the fear of not being able to have sex anymore is like sprinkled all throughout this album. And by the end of the album, Waldo cannot.
And you get the subversiveness of it too, like you get I bet in its time, this is probably a song or like a story that a lot of critics probably listened to or been like, and their gut reaction were probably just like, I can't believe you would paint women in this two-dimensional misogynistic way. Whereas now evaluating it, you're just kind of like, I think Waldo was just a little bit of an incel. Like, I think this is just kind of his fault. Like, I don't really have much sympathy for him when all is said and done. It's just like, if your girlfriend moved on, she moved on, man. Sorry about your luck.
What always struck me about the story listening to this album as a teenager, and Jake, I think you'll be able to relate to this, is that it kind of just has the feel of like a Stephen King short story that you might read in like Skeleton Key or something, Skeleton Crew or something. Like it just has the feel of one of those like little like short stories he would have tossed off for Playboy and just put in one of his compilations. And I was going through a Stephen King phase around the same time that I discovered this band. So like there's an appeal there that's shared. Jacob, you touched on an aspect of this track that I think is an important aspect of the album, which is the kind of sexual nature of this music and the sexual subversion that Lou Reed is really well known for. I mean, his most well-known song ever, Walk on the Wild Side. I mean, that's kind of the quintessential example there. But even as far back as Velvet Underground, that was a key kind of lyrical concern for him, a key part of his kind of punkish glee. And I think you can interpret just about every song on this record to be about sex or orgasms, some more overtly than others. But it dovetails nicely into the third track on the album, Lady Godiva's Operation, which is another kind of storytelling song, but one that's a little bit more oblique, one that's a little bit more open to interpretation, one that I think incorporates a little bit more of Lou Reed's own autobiographical experience, one that shows you a little bit more about his sort of view and the kind of culture that he and the band exist within as well. It's a kind of, queer people and trans people and the equivalent of that at the time in the 60s is a theme, a lyrical concern, the kinds of characters that are sung about on a lot of Velvet Underground songs. I mean, you think about Candy Says off of the Velvet Underground.
That is exactly what I was going to bring up, is that I couldn't stop thinking about that song, which I have always read as being about gender dysphoria, because like I listened to that song and I'm just like, yeah, this is, I mean, it's Candy Says I've come to hate my body and all that it requires. And I'm just like, yeah, this is basically the exact same thing, except uglier.
Yeah. So what do you guys think of this song, Lady Godiva's Operation? It's deeply unsettling. I mean, obviously the whole record is unsettling, but like White Light, White Heat, you just get so caught up in the fire of that song. And then The Gift, it's like, I mean, that song's just hilarious. And I think it's not until you get to this point in the record where how genuinely kind of discomforting it is really starts to set in. And especially because as the record goes on, the extremity in the way that it's produced or not even produced gets more and more and more difficult to ignore. But yeah, this track.
Lady Godiva's Operation at one point was my favorite Velvet Underground song because of, like, it has this very innocent, very lullaby-esque melody. The what I always compared it to was the opening track off of VU and Nico, which is Sunday Morning. Which also kind of has this very lullaby-esque melody to it, even though which also to me is a very apocalyptic song. And Lady Godiva's Operation kind of has that same darkness, even though again it's about a very, very different topic, which Lou Reed himself was sent to electroshock therapy. I don't know if that's a rumor or if it's confirmed or not.
He's spoken about receiving electroshock therapy as a child.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I wasn't exactly. But yeah, like this feels like you're walking to the operating table. Like, and the creepiest part of the song is the ending where it starts in one ear and goes into the other, where it just kind of transitions from speaker to speaker, from headphone to headphone.
Panning.
Thank you. Sorry. Where it pans from one headphone to the other, and like John Cale and Lou Reed are doing these weird vocal exercises as like the background, and it sounds like a breathing machine.
John Cale is doing that with his voice. He's making the breathing machine sound with his voice, and they're kind of like trading off lines. Like one will finish the other's lyric, like, because the song is principally sung by John. Just like The Gift, it's written by Lou and sung by John. But then there's parts in the latter half of the track where the situation that's being depicted starts to get a little bit more kind of frantic and a little bit more unsettling. And you have Lou coming in and kind of like the lines kind of getting cut up, and Lou sort of coming in to sort of finish the line. And it sounds really jagged. And that's actually an aspect of the song that Lou said later on, that he wished they'd done it a bit more smoothly. But I think the jaggedness of it like works in terms of just, well, I mean, everything about this album sounds fucked up and wrong, right? And so little aspects like that, where the vocal clipping and the one voice kind of taking over the other one sounds off. I mean, it doesn't detract from the experience. If anything, it enhances it. But what I really love about this song is that, I mean, we are tempted to read this through the lens of gender transitioning, which is sort of is what is naturally offered by this situation and by the character. But it's never actually made clear exactly what operation Lady Godiva is receiving. It's never made clear exactly what is being done to her. It's not even clear exactly to what extent she is consenting to it. You could read it as an operation to transition her gender. I mean, there are some lyrics that can be read as allusions to genitalia, and there's aspects of the song that could kind of go that way. But Lou doesn't write it so that that's clearly what it's about. And yeah, so that's an aspect of the song that makes it, I think, much, much more unsettling, especially the more attention you pay to it.
I think it's really indicative of, like, you kind of said it was sort of representative of the scene then, and I think that it shows a very like potent intersection of like, to be queer at this time was to be punk rock. Like, these two things were basically the exact same thing, especially in this like art scene that people like Warhol were in, is that it was sort of the beginning of the movement that allowed artists like that to be able to make statements like that. And a song like this too, I feel like the eeriness and the lack of closure and the lack of definition to it is like, it feels really holistic, right? I mean, the uncertainty that a person like, you know, a gay person or a trans person must have felt at that time, you know, there is no immediate closure. There is not even immediate options. The fact that everything is up in the air is a complete translation of what it is to exist like this. And to be like, is this an operation that will help me? Is this something that is like society as a whole is going to push me towards, despite my own feelings on this? And it was clearly something that, like, I mean, written by Lou, where you sort of have this story where you get no answers, but you also don't really get any definitive questions either. And I just kind of feel like it's that, combined with the abrasiveness of both the sound and the structure, really complement how anxiety laden these lyrics are. And it also goes into a point I want to make about the structure of this album, which is just as wonky as anything else about it, because I mean, you have the very comparatively peppy and straightforward song to start off with White Light, White Heat, and then immediately you get an 8-minute long spoken word story with The Gift, and then immediately you have two comparatively shorter rock songs, and then you end it off with a fucking gargantuan track at the end of this, and then the record's over. Like, we talked a lot about album construction when we talked about the Beach Boys, when we talked about the Beatles. And it's so funny that, like, this is all basically in the same era. And we made a point to talk about how, you know, Revolver was kind of shaggy and ugly, and that's what made it cool. But I mean, this fucking makes Revolver look like the first Beach Boys album, for God's sake. It just goes to show you, I guess, the scenes and different nexus of influences that these albums and artists sort of all had at the same time, even though they sort of had the same point of inspiration. It just goes to show you why this was such a vital time for rock music in the late 60s.
Absolutely. Yeah. And at this point in the record, you get something of a reprieve with Here She Comes Now, which is kind of like a necessary, or maybe not necessary, but it acts as kind of like a moment where you can kind of breathe while Lou is doing this kind of simple song that seems to be about a woman having an orgasm, or at least anticipating an orgasm. But again, as with Lou, it can never quite be clear exactly what he's referring to.
Here she comes, am I right?
Yeah, I like the line, "She's made out of wood," which I don't know how to interpret that, whether that is literal or metaphorical. But it just adds this thing where
that's the electroshock therapy for you, baby.
You think you know clearly, okay, I get what he's doing. She's coming. But then he says she's made out of wood, and it's like all of a sudden the directness, the kind of like on the face of it lyricism of the song, you get this thing that seems like some kind of metaphor, and it just complicates the whole thing. It's a nice little song, even if it is pretty short.
Honestly, it's a great song. It's handily my least favorite thing on here, precisely because it's a little bit of a reprieve. I just think this album is so good at being an overwhelming sensory and thematic experience that's why this album has grown on me in the way that it has. That I just like, again, it's not like a good sounding song. It sounds fuck ugly, just like everything else on here. But again, comparatively, I just love how oppressive and claustrophobic this entire thing is. It feels, again, it speaks to the dichotomous nature of the album. Like, any positives that it has, like, you know, the more accessible songs being shorter and slightly less ugly and a little bit easier to get into, and the comparative like shorter runtime of an album that this actually ends up being. Those things are like the only things that feel like they aren't quite compromises yet. But I just love how risky and evil and weird it all sounds. It feels totally congruent with the thematic material, where it gives you no closure, and it gives you like, you just don't know how to feel about anything. It's like the polar opposite of Pet Sounds, where it's like you kind of feel a specific way and all the instruments are like making you feel that way, and you're kind of in like a weird sort of mood limbo, but it's very specific, whereas this is something you're totally suspended in. It's just, you're like wrapped in a cloud of drug hazy static for the entire duration of it.
And so that's side
Speaking
one
of which,
that's side one of the album. Side two of the album, which is one of my favorite sides of vinyl of the 60s. I mean, yes. I'm just going to be frank.
One of the greatest rock songs of all time.
I'm going to be frank. Both of these songs are in my top 5 Velvet Underground songs. I Heard Her Call My Name might be my favorite Velvet Underground song. It certainly felt like it while I was listening to it this morning. This song is... I mean, we've talked about how loud and abrasive and affronting this album is. I mean, this song and Sister Ray, but this song in particular is where that really kind of kicks into high gear. I love
the guitar on this is just absolutely monstrous.
I brought up Ornette Coleman before, and Lou Reed specifically said that his guitar playing on this song was inspired by Ornette Coleman and Jimi Hendrix, and trying to kind of smash the two of them together. And I think when you hear that, when you know that you can hear both of them in the guitar playing on this song, there's this kind of electric fireworksy feel to how just completely incandescent the playing is. That's very, very Hendrix, but there's also this total kind of lack of any tonality or sense of time that very much feels of a piece with Ornette Coleman's classical free jazz. It's a complete melding of influences from jazz and influences from what was at that time like burgeoning rock and roll at its most extreme into this avant-garde fusion, specifically through his playing. And I mean, you have scratches and noise, and you have all kinds of abrasive and hideous texture on this song. And what I love about it, why I even love it just a tiny bit more than Sister Ray, although I both think they're both 10 out of 10 tracks, is that this is doing all of those things in the context of like a somewhat typically structured rock and roll song. So in many ways, it's like the most subversive thing on the album from a musical perspective, is that it is taking this basic structure that you're familiar with from the inherent language of music, and it is doing all of this completely horrific stuff on top of it in a way that I don't even think a single track on the first Velvet Underground album did that quite in this way. You either had the beauty or you had the extended kind of droning. This is, to me, like the quintessential Velvet Underground song, or at least one of them anyway. God, there's so many, but this is the one that completely just, again, as Lou says, splits my mind open every time I listen to it. It is utterly unreal.
Did the Velvet Underground invent stoner rock? Because I think they might have, frankly. I mean, there's so many genres and artists you can link them back to, but this specifically, I'm just like, this reminds me of like High on Fire. Like, what? Dope Throne? What the fuck?
Yeah, I mean, we've mentioned punk and now stoner rock, but also, of course, like noise rock, no wave, all kinds of movements that wouldn't even really come to the fore until the 80s can be rooted here.
First couple Swans albums definitely owe everything to this album.
Absolutely.
You mentioned too, Jake, earlier about how he sounds like a doo-wop singer in White Light, White. Honestly, the same could be said for I Heard Her Call My Name as well. Especially because, and it's an even more extreme example of that song, because you have like, you know, this kind of very typical 50s rock and roll-esque singer, and then just singing over the most monstrous shit imaginable. Love
And
that.
then
Speaking of
we get
monsters.
to Sister Ray, which is, I mean, good God. I mean, yeah, I heard her call my name, my favorite. I mean, this is just as good. It might be tied. The thing that's cool about this track, there's a lot of kind of historic sort of like stories associated with this song. Like their engineer walked out of the studio while they were recording it because he couldn't bear to listen to it. He's like, I'm gonna hit record and leave, and you can come and get me when you're done. I don't need to hear this, I think was the quote. You have the fact that as a beautiful counterpoint to the kind of fractious nature of the band relations at this time in the narrative, you also have the fact that this was recorded all together in one take, this song. Like there's no overdubs, there's no like splicing or anything like that. What you're hearing on this is the recording of the song, the performance of the song as they did it for, I think, the first time in the studio. And it was like, what if anyone fucks up? I mean, to the extent that one can, it's staying in the recording. And so what you get is this piece that has a kind of hellish energy and hellish nature to it that feels as though some kind of demonic, expression is being kind of expressed through these human beings. And you have a sound design that is like completely not making room for any of the performers at all. Like it's almost as if this isn't mixed. It's really like amazing how just conventionally bad and offensive it sounds, and how powerfully it works as a result of that. Like it's kind of the ultimate example of the kind of punk ethos of like stripping away all of the things that you would use to dress up music and just have pure, raw performance with no frills whatsoever. That's a key aspect of the punk ethos that would come to fruition in the 70s. And you can feel it here in the way this is recorded, in the way it sounds, where it's almost like, it's almost like making it sound good or making it sound like conventionally musical would be betraying it in a certain sense. Like it's really as far out as music gets in the 60s.
It's like what you said earlier when you talked about the reason that the Velvet Underground self-title sounds the way it does is not just because of John's departure and Lou's sort of full creative control there, is that imagine you're somebody like Mo Tucker and you have to, endure the recording of White Light, White Heat and the contentious nature of it. And on the other end, it comes out sounding like that. The instrumental presence that you have in the band is basically absorbed by this wall of cacophony. Like their contributions to this sound are like, they're felt because everything's playing at the same time, but there's no like, you can't discern one thing from the next. It's like I completely like, it's simultaneously what makes this song awesome, and also I completely get why the people within the band would have been infinitely frustrated by it. It's like, why am I even here if you're just going to do this? Like I get that, but also this is the greatest noise rock song ever. So
it's a weird contradiction because like you can hear like there's Maureen Tucker just kind of like banging a drum like really, really kind of primitively. You can
in
hear
the trash can, like, is this it? Is this what you want?
You can hear kind of the dual guitars of Lou and Sterling, and you can definitely hear the Vox Continental organ that John Cale is playing through over half of this track. But yet, while you can pick up on those things, they are kind of bled together. Like they are kind of this tapestry that like doesn't have like, they're kind of monochrome in a certain sense, which is it's a black and white song. It sounds like the album cover in a weird way. It just sounds like a kind of wall of darkness.
Okay, so this feels like the anti-Summer of Love. The Velvet Underground, there's a wonderful like it was shared on Twitter recently. It was Lou Reed talking about several bands and artists that the interviewer had asked him for, and he talked about like these California bands, people like Jefferson Airplane, Mothers of Invention. He hated them. He absolutely hated hippies. He absolutely did like the whole like peace and love shit. And this record definitely sounds like anti-peace and love. It sounds like violence. It's about an orgy which suddenly a murder happens and everybody's on heroin and possibly coke and everybody is just in this absolutely fucked up dream state. I think it was just trying to like showcase like this is not our experience with drugs, which is woo wee, I'm having fun. No, our experience of drugs is somebody's passed out on the floor, I'm puking my guts out. There's somebody's pissing. All of this shit is
there's an orgy where there are at least 3 STDs being passed around over there, as well as probably heroin needles. It's not a good time.
Yeah, all of that shit, and that's why I love this song so much. Again, when I heard this, I had not heard anything like it. I was just it felt like it was rewiring my brain, and suddenly like I now knew what I wanted more from music. So
Yeah.
Sister Ray, especially because like Sister Ray, there's like 2 explanations as to who Sister Ray is. The first is a drag queen that John and Lou had known in New York City. And the other is that it's a reference to Ray Davies of the Kinks. And this kind of has like the same kind of structure, at least the first minute or so song. It's just like taken to its highest and most extreme level.
It's like if Gaspar Noé's climax was shot in black and white. That's the song. There you go.
And
it's what Aphex Twin would make if he knew how to play guitar.
And there we have it. White Light, White Heat, an album so just absolutely out there that it couldn't be approximated again for over a decade, really. I mean, the closest any band came in the interim was some of what the Stooges did, but even then, like there's a particular kind of inhuman quality to the way this sounds that is so unique. Even today, even in the legions of hundreds of bands directly influenced by this album specifically, that it's just an instant classic.
The boundaries that had to be pushed for this album, I mean, like that's why people like the Stooges even like they owe themselves to this. And I honestly think too that this also ties back to the now time-honored tradition of having queer artists with really, really abrasive music. It goes all the way back to the Velvet Underground, and we see that now with people like Backwash, with people like Black Dresses. They are all pursuing something that is distinctly, comparatively atonal, like, and that's what makes it cool, is that it's not just because it's noisy in a specific way that opposes whatever the mainstream is obsessed with. It's not just chaotic in a pure sense, it's chaotic in a dichotomous sense, which is it's a dichotomy for the album and in the album, which is why it's kind of genius.
Yeah, I mean, not even just queer people, obviously, like it's counterculture. It's the sound of the counterculture, whatever group that may be. And this is the sound of 60s counterculture at its most intense. I like, Jacob, that you called it anti-Summer of Love, because that's kind of like a beautiful way of putting it. And I think it's meaningful as well that one of the very last things that Lou Reed did before he died was publish a glowing, and I mean like extremely glowing, review of Kanye West's Yeezus, which he called like one of the great pieces of art
that makes so much fucking sense. I mean, like, I don't even have to think about it. It's just like, yeah, that sure.
And I think you can trace the lineage through hundreds of artists from White Light, White Heat to that record, and White Light, White Heat is where it all begins.
Not to be too MU about it, but this album, like a very similar band in ethos for the 2010s, Death Grips,
I mean,
ex-military.
Yeah.
That's that is exactly this. I mean, like, in hell, that was basically that band like talked about. It's like, yeah, before we were a band and musicians and made music, we like lived in the urban streets of fucking California. It fucking sucked. And that's what all their music's about. It's like, yeah, that's absolutely what the Velvet Underground was.
And like Nirvana too, and like so many of these seminal countercultural bands all share that aspect, and it all goes back to this.
And you mentioned Death Grips. MC Ride shouts out the song Lady Godiva's Operation, or it's interpreted that he shouts out Lady Godiva's Operation in the song Inanimate Sensation.
I mean,
there we go.
Close the loop.
All right,
Well,
well, let's rate this bad boy. Jake, why don't you kick us off?
my 3 favorite tracks, which is, I mean, it's a 6-track long album, so, but still, I gotta go with I Heard Her Call My Name, I gotta go with The Gift, and I have to go with, of course, Sister Ray. And I give this album an 8.5 out of 10. It is currently my least favorite Velvet Underground project, and I love it a lot. So good band, I think.
As for me, my 3 favorites are Sister Ray, I Heard Her Call My Name, and White Light, White Heat. And I'm going to give the album an 8.
Favorite tracks are Sister Ray, Lady Godiva's Operation, and White Light, White Heat. And this is getting the old 10 out of 10.
Sick.
Every time I hear Lady Godiva, I just, in my head, it's fitting that I just hear it in the tune of Lady Madonna.
So that is an average rating of 8.8 out of 10. Let us know at home what you think of the Velvet Underground's White Light, White Heat. How does it compare to you to their other records? What do you think of its importance within the catalog? What do you think of the sound? What do you think of the songs? Let us know in the comments below. We want to hear your interpretations. We want to hear your thoughts. If you enjoyed the episode, please remember that if you're listening on a streaming service, to give the podcast 5 stars. And if you are watching on YouTube, to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you have not already. Both of those things do a huge amount to help us out. If you want to go above and beyond and support us even more on the YouTube channel, you can hit the join button, and for just $1 a month, you can support the channel, become one of our channel family members, and get yourself entitled to certain perks, such as having your name featured in the title scroll of every single video we do, having priority comment responses, and if you want to give us recommendations as well, then they'll go to the top of the pile. So that's an additional option that we have as well. But thanks for watching. As always, rock over London, rock on Chicago, BMW, the ultimate driving machine.